Hi there, welcome to the camera settings lecture for the DJI Go app 4. We're on version 4.1.15. It'll be taught on the Phantom 4 Pro, but I'll refer to the Mavic. Please make sure that you're familiar with photography concepts. If not, just go back to the lecture before this. Let's jump right in. Okay, here we are on the DJI Go app on the live view. It's important to know about the camera information in the top middle here, just so during your shot you know exactly what you're doing. So currently we're shooting in auto. The ISO is set at 200, shutter speed 1/25th of a second, f-stop or aperture 2.8, EV is 0, color filter D Cine-like, and white balance auto 2000 Kelvin. The SD card capacity is showing that for our video profile of 4K 24p we can shoot an hour and 25 minutes. So it's quite useful to be able to look at the top of the screen and see what's going on. Okay, so a quick way to access your exposure settings and make changes while you're flying is to use the EV wheel on the top right of your remote controller. On the Phantom 4 Pro you can press this wheel in to make it active. On the Mavic you can't press it in, you just scroll it. So on the Phantom 4 Pro, if I press it in, you will see the EV value turns blue, which means we can now adjust the EV value. We can rotate the wheel clockwise to bring it all the way up to +3 stops. And we can go in the opposite direction all the way to -3 or back to 0. If we press it in again and one more time, ISO becomes active. We can pull it back to become locked at 100, or we can change it back to an auto ISO value. Okay, so let's bring it back to locked in at 100, and let's tap on the camera settings icon under the shutter button. And on the top left, if we tap on that, we go into the exposure view. You'll see by default it's set to auto. And the one thing that we can do on auto exposure for the Phantom 4 Pro is we can either leave it locked in at 100 or whatever value we choose, or we can tap on auto and let the camera decide. Next is we can tap on aperture priority, and this allows us on the 4 Professional to choose the aperture, whatever value we want. We can go all the way from 11 down to 2.8, and whatever value we choose and we lock in, the camera will then adjust the ISO and the shutter speed to maintain good exposure for that value. On the Mavic and the Phantom 3, the aperture is locked in at 2.8. There is no apertures that you can choose. Shutter priority allows you to set your shutter speed. So in this case, a good idea is to have your shutter speed at double your frame rate. I usually shoot at a frame rate of around 30p. So I would be looking for a shutter speed of about 60. And very handily, I can go in and set this to 60 with shutter priority. With the Mavic and the Phantom 3, if your shutter speed is higher than 60, so it's like 500 or 1000, just depending on how bright it is, you're going to have to use an ND filter, neutral density filter, to bring your shutter speed right down to get the same effect. Now for video, you can bring your shutter speed down to 25. That's the lowest. That's 1/25th of a second. But if you're going to still photography, you can do long exposure shots, for example 1 second or even more. Finally, if we move over to manual, here you have control over ISO, aperture and shutter. And over here at the bottom you can actually see whether you're under or overexposed. So here we -2 on the manual meter, which means we need to get this up. So what I'll do is I'll reduce my shutter speed to let in more light, and I increase the ISO. And by doing a combination of those, I get the metering to reflect 0, which means perfectly exposed. And now we're good to go. Okay, I'll bring it back to auto for the rest of the lecture. Something for the Phantom 4 Professional owners, you might not know about this, but if you shoot in D-Log, you will see over here that your ISO is locked in at 500 and you can't adjust it. So just be aware of that. If you're going to be doing still photography and you want to have 100 ISO, provided you're shooting in RAW, then just choose any other color filter. You'll see later the color filter makes no difference when you're shooting in RAW. I'll show you that later. But you want to get your ISO down to 100. Avoid D-Log for still photography. If we look at the Mavic exposure settings, you'll see you can only choose between auto and manual. If you look at auto, you can move your EV up or down. That's the same as using the wheel. And if you go to manual, you've got control over ISO and shutter. But because the aperture is fixed at 2.8, which is wide open, on a bright day, you're going to need an ND filter to get your shutter speed down to a manageable level. Okay, let's look at the second section, which is your actual camera type settings. So we're going to start off with video settings. And the first option is video size. So on the Phantom 4 Pro, you've got access to true 4K, that's 4096 by 2160. This is different to UHD, ultra high definition, which is 3840 by 2160. So over here you can see that we can shoot up to 30 frames per second in true 4K, but wait, it gets better. If we change our encoding format from H.265 to H.264, then we can actually go up to 60. So 60p in true 4K, that is remarkable, and that is on the Phantom 4 Pro as well as the Inspire 2. If we then look at the next set, the UHD can also go up to 60, same as 2.7K. 1080p allows us to shoot at 120 frames per second, which is amazing because we can then slow that footage right down if we want to get a beautiful slow-mo effect. Same with 720. Coming back here, you'll notice that I have the option of choosing 30 frames per second, and this is because we're shooting in NTSC. If we switch it over to PAL and we come back, you'll see the 30 becomes 25, the 60 becomes 50. So why is this an issue? Well, if you're going to be delivering your project over the web, which most of us are, YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, a frame rate of 25 can give more motion cadence and judder during playback. And if you have a frame rate of 30 or multiples of 30, so 30p, 60p, the playback is generally smoother over computer screens. So that's something to think about, in which case you must record in NTSC and either choose 30p or 60p. Of course, if you're working on a project and you're going to be joining other footage like other cameras, and the frame rate, for example, is set at 24p for the main camera, you must make sure that you match the frame rate. It's very important that your frame rate matches what the other cameras are going to be using. Otherwise, you're going to have a major headache in post-production. Okay, so we're going to go back to NTSC and 30p. If we look at the Mavic, you'll see we have fewer options. If we want to go in true 4K, we can only shoot in 24p. UHD lets us go up to 30. 2.7K the same. 1080 lets us go up to 60 and 96 frames per second. And it's only on 720 that we can go up to 120 frames per second to do those slow-mo shots. Okay, carrying on, if we look at video format, you've got a choice between MP4 or MOV. This is completely up to you. Next, we can look at NTSC and PAL, which we've discussed. And then next is white balance. If we look at white balance, you can go with auto, or you can set a value. I'm not mad about these predefined white balances. So what value would you set it at if you want to lock in your white balance? Well, all that you have to do is go back to the screen. You'll see that auto is showing us a value of 2300. So if we come back to white balance, it'll typically take the value that's in auto, and then if you just select it, it'll lock it in. But just be aware that the next time you fly, you must change this value because the white balance will probably be different. So if you go fly on a really warm day, where the white balance should rather be, say, 5000, but you locked it in on your previous flight to 2300, you're going to be in for a bit of a nasty surprise. Okay, under white balance, we then have style. What is style? Style lets you adjust your sharpness, your contrast, and your saturation. Standard gives you a pretty good result, but if you're going to be doing anything professional where you need to do post-production, go for custom and set everything to -2, -2, -2. This will give you more room in recovering details, and it'll help you avoid crushed blacks and flattened whites. Your image will look pretty flat, so if you're not into editing, go with standard, but if you're going to be going the pro way, remember to use these custom settings. One word of advice is if you're going to be using the Mavic Pro, there is something that happens in low light conditions where you get these soft patches on your video feed, and that is because it's trying to denoise the image and something is going wrong. So the fix that I've researched is to change your sharpness to +1 on the Mavic, and that will actually avoid that problem of soft patches. So just remember that with the Mavic, if you're having soft patches, try +1 on sharpness. Next we look at your color filters. Okay, so at the moment I'm shooting in D-Log, which is the one you're going to want to shoot in for professional purposes. If you decide that you want to grade your footage, or you want to make it work with other cameras on the project, you're going to have to shoot in D-Log. Otherwise, you've got a choice of these four. The rest are more gimmicky. So let's look at none. None, the problem is your blacks are very, very strong. It's very high contrast. I wouldn't go with it. The same as true color. If you go for Cine, you'll see everything opens up. You get more detail. And then, of course, D-Log, you've got the most detail. So if you're lazy and you're not into video editing, I would go with Cine, and I would go for style standard. And that way you'll get a pretty good result. But if you want the professional route and you want to make sure that you've got complete control, go for D-Log and then -2, -2, -2. Except for the Mavic where your sharpness is +1. The rest are a little bit gimmicky if you look at them. And if we look at the Mavic, you have an extra one called Vivid, which is also pretty nice, but it might be a little bit too vivid, in which case go with Cine-like, which I think is pretty good if you're not in the mood for D-Log and doing a lot of post-production. Okay, and then encoding format, we discussed it. On the Phantom 4 Pro, you can choose H.264, which is the default for your Mavic and your Phantom 3, or you can do H.265. H.265 will give you a better result, but it does limit your shooting options. So it's up to you which one you want to go. If you want to go for the absolute professional look, go H.265, go video 4K 30p, and go in D-Log. Okay, finally, for this lecture, we're going to be looking at the still photography settings, and then the next lecture, we'll look at the general settings. So firstly, under photo, you've got various modes. You can do a single shot, you can do burst, which for the Phantom 4 Pro lets you shoot up to 14. The Mavic only lets you go up to 7. You have AEB, you can do 3 or 5. It stands for Automated Exposure Bracketing. Now on the Phantom 4 Pro, you only have AEB, which means if you want to get HDR, high dynamic range photographs, let's just say there's a lot of contrast on the scene and you want to merge it all together and get a good balanced exposure, you would then have to use AEB and then you'd have to go into post-production software to fix it. With the Mavic, you actually have HDR, but they've removed HDR from the Phantom 4 Pro. And then finally, you have interval, where the photograph will be taken at a determined interval. So with the Phantom 4 Pro, if you're shooting in RAW, the lowest value is 5 seconds. With the Mavic, if you're shooting in RAW, the lowest value is 10 seconds. And with both the Phantom 4 and the Mavic, if you switch from RAW to JPEG, you can get your interval down to 2 seconds. So if you're going to be doing photogrammetry or surveys and you need your camera to take photographs often, make sure you use JPEG and then you can get 2-second interval. Okay, let's look at image ratio. So for your Phantom 4 Pro, you've got 3 options, 4:3, 16:9, and 3:2. With your Mavic and your Phantom 3, you've got 4:3 and 16:9. So if you have a Mavic or Phantom 3, go with 4:3 because 16:9 is just a cropped version of 4:3. If you have the Phantom 4 Pro, shoot in 3:2 because it has the height of 4:3 and the width of 16:9. So if you look at this picture on the left, you will see some photographs on the wall. If we go into 4:3, you'll see that the width is slightly cropped. And then just look at how many blocks are above this white block here. If we go to 16:9, you'll see it's removed some of those blocks. But in 3:2, we've got the full vertical depth as well as the width. So if you have a Phantom 4 Pro, shoot in 3:2 and rather do your cropping in post-production. The rest, which is image format, white balance, style, and color, what I've said previously pretty much applies. The one thing that you need to understand with photography is that there's a big difference between shooting in JPEG and RAW. So what will happen is if you shoot in JPEG, whatever color profile you set will get baked into the end result. So if you shoot in black and white, your JPEG will be black and white. But if you shoot in RAW, it actually doesn't adopt your color filter. So we're going to do a test where we shoot in black and white, JPEG and RAW, and then we're also going to choose another color filter like sepia, and we're going to shoot in JPEG and RAW. And if we bring all of these images into Lightroom, you'll see something really interesting. With the JPEGs, they've got the color filter, so you've got black and white and sepia. But if we look at the RAW photographs, which are DNGs, they don't adopt the color filter. So that is really something to consider. Just remember that if you shoot in D-Log on the Phantom 4 Pro, it'll lock you in at an ISO of 500. And for photography, we're always trying to get our ISO down to 100 if possible. So just avoid D-Log in that case. Okay, excellent. We're now going to go over to part 2, where we're going to be looking at the general camera settings, and then we're done with the camera settings. Thank you.